What's happening, everybody? It's Sean with Reactions to the Classics, and today we have a top 10 Rolling Stones songs from the 60s put together meticulously by our friend and longtime supporter of the channel, Evan David. Evan David, always appreciate everything you bring, not only in your top 10s, but also to our live streams that we have every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Check out the Twitch link below. And if you'd like us to do a top 10 for you, song reaction, song battle, or support us in any way, check out the Patreon link below. The patrons make this thing go. On Evan David's top 10s, he always puts these fantastic write-ups. He's literally one of the best writers I've ever read. So we're going to have a lot of upfront info on the Stones. If you know the Stones well, you might know all this, but you'll probably learn something. If you don't know the Stones super well, you're definitely going to learn something about how the band formed and those sorts of things. So we're going to get to that, and then we'll get to this top 10. So this is all Evan David's words. I do all the research on the channel. I don't have to do any research for his stuff, like none. But he says, rock and roll legend has it that the second most important chance meeting to shape 60s musical history took place on Platform 2 of Dartford Railway Station in Kent, England on the 17th of October, 1961. There, a 17-year-old art student named Keith Richards, who was carrying a Hofner electric guitar, noticed that a childhood acquaintance of his, the 18-year-old London School of Economics student Michael Jagger, was himself carrying several precious blues and rock and roll vinyl records under his arm, which he acquired via a transatlantic mailing list from the legendary Chess Records label in Chicago, and which included The Best of Muddy Waters and Rockin' at the Hops by Chuck Berry. This immediately drew longtime Berry fanatic Keith's interest, for as he himself later put it, back then the long playing record was a very small market in England. Top of the line stuff. It's the music I'm trying to listen to. I've got a few singles, but he's got the bloody albums just sitting in that train carriage in Dartford. It was almost like we made a deal without knowing it, like Robert Johnson at the Crossroads. There's a bond made there that, despite everything else, goes on, like a solid deal. Soon after renewing their acquaintance at Dartford Station, Richards joined Jagger's small-time rhythm and blues group known as Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys. What a name, man. And began a soon-to-be legendary musical partnership, which, despite many trials and tribulations, would endure for nearly 60 years and counting as of this writing. The next key date in the history of the Stones was April 7, 1962. It was then that Mick and Keith went to see the so-called godfather of British blues, Alexis Korner's Blues Incorporated group, at the Ealing Jazz Club venue in West London, later jamming with Korner's group alongside their friend Dick Taylor. At this point, Korner's group included three future Stone stalwarts and highly esteemed jazz-influenced drummer Charlie Watts, Scottish-born keyboardist Ian Stewart, and most importantly, perhaps, slide guitarist and future multi-instrumentalist Brian Jones. Born in Cheltenham, England, but of Welsh descent, Jones, a 20-year-old blues aficionado and musical prodigy, was then briefly going under the more blues pseudonym of Elmo Lewis, and was also bound and determined to start his own rhythm and blues-centric band with himself as the leader. To this end, he began by first roping in Stewart and then Jagger and Richards, amongst others, to form what became the Rolling Stones, who were hastily named, I always wondered this, after a Muddy Waters blues tune by Brian when he was put under pressure to come up with a name for the band while on a phone call with a journalist, and who played their first gig using that name at the also soon-to-be legendary Marquee Club in London on July 12, 1962. By the beginning of 1963, both the somewhat older bassist Bill Wyman and the long sought-after drummer Charlie Watts joined the Stones, and on January 14, 1963, the definitive 60s Stones lineup of Jagger, Richards, Jones, Watts, Wyman, and Stewart probably made their public live debut at the Flamingo Club in Soho. In quick succession, they gained a residency at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond, England, whose owner, Giorgio Gomeski, who thought he was the Stones' manager but didn't leave anything to that effect in writing, much later, to his chagrin, invented none other than the Beatles to see one of their electrifying rhythm and blues-driven shows here. The Fab Four were impressed with the Stones, no doubt indeed. George Harrison would soon recommend them to Dick Rowe of Decca Records, who had notoriously turned the Beatles themselves down and was not about to make the same mistake twice. But even more impressed was one Andrew Loog Oldham, then only 19 years old and working as a publicity assistant for Brian Epstein. See, the Beatles and Stones are so intertwined, man. Who was blown away by the Stones and swiftly schemed to replace the hapless Gomeski as the now Rolling Stones' first true manager, electing to position the band as an establishment-defying anti-Beatles, a highly effective, if increasingly double-edged publicity stunt. Oldham also dropped the older Ian Stewart from the official Stones lineup as he didn't suit the youthful image he was trying to create. But Stewart didn't go away. Nevertheless, he continued to play a key unofficial musical role, both on stage and in the studio for decades to come until his death from a heart attack in 1985. So began a truly outrageous outlaw odyssey, which would see the Stones lurching breakneck from one landmark rock and roll event to another for the rest of the decade, beginning by releasing their first Decca single, a cover of the Chuck Berry tune Come On, in June of '63, with the Beatles contributing the follow-up in the shape of the future Ringo track, I Want to Be Your Man, which John and Paul more or less finished composing on the spot in front of the Stones, highly impressing them. If you don't know that story, go check that out. And then releasing their first self-titled album in April of '64, which would be repackaged as England's newest hitmakers for the US in May of the same year. At the same time, the Stones followed up the mayhem generated by their British concerts by touring the US, where the rebellious attitude was met with a mixture of bemused insults and stark disapproval by establishment showbiz figures such as Dean Martin and Ed Sullivan, the latter of whom sworn he would never have them back on his TV show, but who had to relent due to youthful popular demand a mere 6 months later, while also meeting several key American influences on their style, both past and future, such as Muddy Waters, whom they found painting the ceiling at Chess Studios, of all things, when they went to record there, and of course James Brown, whose frenetic stage moves Jagger subsequently sought to copy to the very best of his ability. Over the rest of the '60s, the Stones would grow from strength to strength musically, with the increasingly prolific Jagger-Richards songwriting partnership fueling their shift from an exciting R&B covers band to a place where they could perhaps rival even the aforementioned Beatles in terms of the sheer depth and variety to be found in their ever-growing catalog. For as Mick himself put it, every little moment we had, Keith and I used to be sitting with guitars trying to write songs. We wrote songs all the time. We were constantly coming up with ideas. We started writing songs that were reflective of the time we were living in, and that struck a chord with our audience. You're connecting and you're getting a lot of feedback. You're feeling what the audience is feeling. You're exchanging with the audience a kind of ideas stream. This seemingly symbiotic mutual connection between the Stones and their young audience would soon propel the band, and especially the charismatic and articulate Jagger, to a position where they could effectively express the frustration that both they and their fans increasingly felt with an adult world where within, as Stones biographer Stephen Davis put it, national alienation was so corrosive that even the post-war children, the baby boomer members of the wealthiest, most secure, and best educated generation in history, are saying, no, we can't get any satisfaction either. Unfortunately, all this success would lead to two negative consequences for the group. The first of which being that their roguish, rebellious antics, whether initially public driven by Oldham or otherwise, would finally piss off the British establishment so much that it would effectively mount the campaign to bring these upstarts down a peg or two, eventually culminating with perhaps the most infamous drug bust in musical history taking place at Keith Richards' home on the 12th of February 1967, with the result that both him and Jagger could have served real jail time that would have crippled the band, if not finished it altogether. But in the end, powerful press lobbying on behalf of the outlaw duo helped them get their sentences effectively squashed. But if establishment thought all this would have a different deterrent effect on the Stones, Keith insisted it had the opposite effect, claiming, quote, I think I looked at it at the time as they can try all they want. They won't make this stick because I've got all these people out there. And unless I murdered somebody, they're going to insist that I'm out. It cemented our relationships with our generation, with the public. And it sort of gave us a badge of honor in a way. You know, it's Jesse James time. The cops turned me into a criminal, fully blown. That was when you really put the black hat on. Before that, it was just sort of off gray. So all you really did was make Keith embrace this and go way further in that direction. Another key member of the Stones would not be so lucky, unfortunately, Brian Jones, whose gradual musical and personal decline would be the second more long-term negative consequence of both his and the Stones' ultimately unshakable, lingering notoriety. For not only did Brian have his own ongoing series of drug busts or convictions to contend with, which eventually would lead to him being unable to tour the U.S. as a result, but all this was coupled with the equally seismic psychic aftershocks of his decidedly turbulent relationship with his most significant paramour, Anita Pallenberg, who would eventually leave him for none other than fellow bandmate Keith Richards. Above all, however, it was Brian's increasing loss of power and influence over the band, which he had founded, that would have perhaps the biggest cumulative effect on him, as well as latent musical potential remained formidable throughout. Indeed, even Bill Wyman still insists that Brian had more raw musical talent than the rest of the Stones put together. The fact was his creative role at the heart of the group was slowly but inevitably eclipsed by the aforementioned steady growth of the Jaggers-Richards songwriting partnership, a form of musical skill which even the gifted multi-instrumentalist Jones could never really master on that songwriting side, without really having that impact in the band or his girl now, and eventually only being able to make fleeting contributions in the studio due to his often drug-fueled paranoia. He was eventually fired from the Stones in June of '69, and then sadly became the inaugural member of rock and roll's famous 27 Club under mysterious circumstances where he drowned in a swimming pool a mere 3 weeks later. In a sad end for the Stone, who, as Bill Wyman said, formed the band, he chose the members, he named the band, he chose the music we play, he got us gigs, he was very influential, very important, and then slowly lost it. Highly intelligent and just kind of wasted it and blew it all away. Those drugs, man, you're never going to win with those things. We lost so many artists to that. Following Brian's untimely death, they quickly turned the free festival concert that they'd originally planned at London's Hyde Park a mere 2 days later, and which was meant to be a grand unveiling of their new guitarist Mick Taylor to an impromptu memorial for Brian, which would be peacefully be attended by more than 250,000 people. Such calls to hippie-style peace and love would sadly fall on deaf ears a few months later as their other major free festival to take place in 1969, namely the notorious Altamont concert outside San Francisco, where a sinister atmosphere of rage and chaos would culminate in the murder of one spectator by the very Hells Angels who were supposed to protect everybody and run in security. As such, you could be forgiven for thinking that Stones would end the 60s under a turbulent cloud, and yet the fact remains that in pure musical terms, and especially given the soon-to-be confirmed demise of their nearest rivals, the Beatles, by the end of '69, the Stones were ultimately in a unique position whereby, as Stephen Davis once put it, it had been 7 years since they started, Brian Jones was dead, and the new guy would never become one of them. Some think their best work was already behind the Stones and that they would spend the rest of their career defending often successfully their self-bestowed heavyweight title as the greatest rock and roll band in the world. Given all this weighty and well-known history behind the Stones' epic career during the 60s, it would come as no surprise that trying to pick a mere 10 tunes in order to properly highlight their era-defining achievements during this decade hasn't been easy for me, to say the least. The interesting thing about this material is there was no common thread to it. If every album made sounded different to its predecessor, and every single seemed to break new artistic ground, even the Beatles, also artistically reckless and eclectic, at least retained a trademark on their record in the form of their distinctive harmonies. The answer is, there really wasn't any Stones trademark sound in the 60s except sheer quality. In trying to compile my top 10 list from the contents of the 8 UK or 10 US studio albums that the Stones released, as well as a plethora of singles during the 60s. Therefore, I was trying to bear in mind two main criteria as follows. A, I decided my list would be presented in roughly chronological order rather than order of preference, so as to show how the Stones' music evolved during this time. So catch that. It's chronological. It's not 10-1 with one being the best. And I also decided I didn't want to feature too many of the Stones' biggest or most famous 60s hits in the top 10 to avoid over-familiarity in terms of my reaction. And he says I especially didn't want to feature too many songs that I knew the guys had already reacted to in one way, shape, or form, or if I did, at least give them something fresh to react to by including video clips of said tunes that we hadn't seen yet. So once again, that's great, but really you can include whatever you want, because we've done Beggar's Banquet, we've done Let It Bleed, we've done Sticky Fingers, we've done Exile on Main Street. Those full reviews are up on the channel. But, I mean, this is a reaction to a top 10 and how they all fit together. So finally, Evan David says, bottom line though, I'm categorically not trying to claim this top 10 list as being definitive in any way, shape, or form. But the fact simply remains that these were the 10 Rolling Stones tunes that I ultimately enjoyed listening to the most while going through their entire 60s discography, although it was still a real wrench to leave some of my honorable mentions, of which you'll see more later, out in the end. Regardless, I hope you all enjoy this top 10. And even if you don't, please feel more than free to leave your own alternative list in the comments below. These things are so difficult to put together. I know Evan David worked on this for weeks to get this like he wanted it. So with that, let's jump to this top 10. First off, there won't be any music in the video itself. Check out the Vimeo link below if you want to watch along with me through all of it. I invite you to do so. If you also want to know what I think of these, just hang around here. The first song is not going to be on Spotify. It's a YouTube video, and of course it's the famous I Can't Get No Satisfaction. Evan David says, more than any other perhaps, this is a tune, as Mick Jagger put it, really made the Rolling Stones. Satisfaction changes from just another band into a huge monster band. You always need one song. Indeed, this tune would eventually reach number one in both the US and UK charts upon its release in the summer of '65, and was also released on the US version of the Stones' Out of Our Heads album in July of the same year. Yet its genesis was one of sheer serendipity, when, in a matter very reminiscent of Paul McCartney's composition of Yesterday, the iconic fuzz box guitar riff that formed the core of this tune came to Keith in his sleep, whereupon, only half awake, he recorded it using the guitar and cassette player that lay next to his bed. Upon rediscovering the riff, when he rewound the tape in the morning. Keith played it to Jagger and told him to use the words, "I can't get no satisfaction" in the song. While Keith's irresistible guitar work may get the lion's share of credit for the sheer energy of this tune, however, Mick's razor-sharp, media-savvy lyrics certainly also played a vital part in its success to boot. For as Mick himself put it, "I can't express myself in the right way when I feel satisfied with the world. It's very easy if I feel very dissatisfied with something. I can write about that because most young people are dissatisfied with the generation which they think is running their lives." The extent to which the combined result of Mick and Keith's joint efforts resonated with the frustrations of his generation certainly helped to make Satisfaction, as Stones biographer Stephen Davis put it, the Rolling Stones' decisive moment, a cautious but somehow powerful statement of the individual, mass culture, and sexual norms. But the main reason why the song has since become immortal is surely because it's just so darn good. And its pure rocking power is perhaps best captured by this clip, which is taken from a documentary about the Stones' 65 tour of Ireland called "Charlie Is My Darling." It was lost for decades, resurfaced in 2012. Again, to quote Stephen Davis, at this point, the Stones were regarded by other rockers as the best live band in the world. Their concerts were interactive lust fiestas with a backbeat, and no one who saw the Stones play live in these times ever forgot it. Wow, what a performance, man. It's always amazing to see these performances from the 60s, from the Beatles time. These people are screaming. You can't hear anything. There's a priest up there in the front row. All the security, man, that guy at the end was crying, and then they grabbed him and threw him back in behind the crowd. Wow, it's crazy to see these guys so young, man. But the energy, you could really feel it. Really good clip there to choose. The song itself, fantastic. And everybody knows this song. Just about everybody who's ever listened to music knows this song. They just know that, at least, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" riff of it. He starts out driving in his car, and a man comes on the radio telling him more and more about useless information supposed to fire his imagination. No, no, no. And then he gets in the chorus. Then he's watching his TV. So he's driving his car, then he watches his TV. Then a man comes on and tells him how white my shirts can be. Well, he can't be a man because he doesn't smoke the same cigarettes as me. No, no, no. Then he's driving around this world and doing this, and I'm singing that. And I'm trying to make some girl who tells me, "Baby, better come back maybe next week," because you see, I'm on a losing streak. He can't get no satisfaction. Just a nice progression. The lyrics, no one I think ever really talks about, but the lyrics, very well written story to that, with that anti-establishment theme. So as you can see below in the Spotify bar, next up is "Playing with Fire." Evan David says, "While I was avidly re-listening to the Stones' 60s discography in order to compile this list, one of the things that stood out for me the most was the fact that while Mick's historic reputation as a consummate rock frontman is obviously well-deserved, what sometimes gets a little lost in the shuffle is just how good Jagger was, and to a larger extent still is, in purely vocal terms alone. And this eerie 1965 tune, credited to Nanker Felge, an early pseudonym for songs written collectively by the Stones, originally released as a B-side to the Last Time single in both the UK and US, as well as on the aforementioned US version of the Out of Our Heads album to boot, is a prime early demonstration of this fact. After all, in the hands of a lesser vocalist, this warning to a smug, high society lady not to complacently underestimate the social and emotional havoc that her lower class lover can cause her if she mistreats him could come across as mere bluff or arrogance on the singer's part. But when a sneering, snarling Jagger does it, the results are quite frankly downright sinister in their effect. Wow, what a great vocal performance, man. Mick sounds fantastic. I like this song a lot. I've never heard it. It starts out, "Well, you've got your diamonds and you've got your pretty clothes and the chauffeur drives your car. You let everybody know. But don't play with me because you're playing with fire. Your mother, she's an heiress, owns a block in St. John's Wood," a rich place. "And your father'd be there with her if only he could. Don't play with me because you're playing with fire. Your old man took her diamonds and tiaras by the score. Now she gets her kicks in Stepney, not in Knightsbridge anymore." And the last verse kind of gets to it. "Now you got some diamonds and you will have some others, but you better watch your step, girl, or start living with your mother." So he's warning her, you treat me right, you stay faithful to me, I'm going to kick you over and you're going to live with your mother. I thought the guitar work on there was fantastic. The instrumentation and arrangement was just right to bring you in, because it's really about the lyrics and about Mick's, as Evan David put it, eerie almost vocal delivery on this one. I really enjoyed that one. Now we're up to number 8. As you see below, as "Tears Go By," Evan David says this wistful, yearning ballad is a complete contrast to the previous tune in many ways. Yet despite its undoubted quality, its origins are in some ways almost as, if not more fascinating than the song itself. For while the Stones' own version was released on the US only December's Children and Everybody's, and as a US single, which reached number 6 on the Billboard charts in December of 65, with a UK release on the B-side of the Stones' 19th Nervous Breakdown single following in February of 66. The song itself was first composed back in 64 and is one of the first, if not the first song written by Jagger and Richards. By all accounts, however, the initial impetus behind the creation of this song owed a great deal to their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, who insisted that I want a song with brick walls around it, high windows, and no sex. Up to that point, the Stones had more or less been a mere cover band, albeit a really good one. But the savvy Oldman had already realized just how much more lucrative it would be if they would write their own tunes, as erstwhile employer Brian Epstein's proteges, the Beatles, had already amply demonstrated. As Keith later admitted, quote, the force of Andrew's logic was already apparent to us. You've either got to capture a songwriter or start doing it yourself, which was quite a shocking thought. So he put us in a room and said, don't come out until you've got a song. I don't know if he actually turned the key or not to lock them in. So Mick and I sat there staring at the tape recorder. We smoked. Eventually, we had to really pee, so we finally put something together and banged on the door. Andrew got up from watching TV. We gave him the tape and headed for the bathroom. And he gave it to another of his own proteges, singer Marianne Faithfull, who would later, of course, famously date Mick for much of the latter half of the 60s. Faithfull later said, God knows how Mick and Keith wrote it or where it came from. In any case, it's an absolutely astonishing thing for a boy of 20 to have written a song about a woman looking back nostalgically on her life. Her version would peak at number 9 in both the UK and US charts in 64. But as good as it is, I would much prefer the Stones' own version, especially as the melancholic, nostalgic vulnerability found in Jagger's voice speaks very powerful to those like myself, Evan Davis saying, who are either old souls at heart or who regret having to grow up at all. As Tears Go By, what a beautiful song. Some people think it was put out in answer to Yesterday by the Beatles, which had come out earlier in 65. A short song. It's basically just saying it's the evening of the day. I sit and watch the children play. Smiling faces I can see, but not for me. I sit and watch as tears go by. So it starts out with the chorus. Then you get the verse. My riches can't buy everything. I want to hear the children sing. All I hear is the sound of rain falling on the ground. I sit and watch as tears go by. And then he repeats the chorus. So yeah, I think he's reminiscing on maybe his childhood gone and wishes he could go back, but he can't go back. And that's where you get my riches can't buy everything. So no matter how much money you have, you can't get back time, right? Time's the one thing that you have a finite amount of and you can't, quote, buy any more of it. So really enjoyed that one. Now we're up to the 7th selection. It's Get Off My Cloud. Once again, we're going to go to YouTube to watch this. Evan Davis says, surprisingly, Keith has never really rated this cracking tune. First released as a single in the fall of 65 and eventually reaching number 1 in both the UK and the US, where it would also be included on the aforementioned December's Children album, regarding it as a far too rushed attempt to follow up on the success of Satisfaction, and as being poorly produced by Oldham to boot. All of which goes to show that even the legendary human riff can be wrong, as I, for one, have always loved this tune with its disjointed tale of the singer's tired, exasperated longing for isolation and or some peace so they can finally go to sleep amidst a seemingly endless night full of urban chaos, which not only appeals to habitual night owls like myself, Evan David saying, but I'm a night owl as well, but which also possesses a certain paranoid quality that not only aptly reflects the times it was created in. Indeed, Mick Jagger himself describes it as a stop bugging me post-teenage alienation song. The grown-up world was a very ordered society in the early 60s, and I was coming out of it. But in some ways appears to be even more representative of the extreme social anxiety bordering on paranoia that our current lockdown age has sadly all too often generated, even as the singer sits, quote, at home looking out the window, imagining the world to stop. None of this, however, can belie the sheer aggravated energy that this tune evoked in its listeners. As to quote Stephen Davis once again, Mick Jagger called out of the radio sinister as a switchblade, as this new rant made him into the most potent rock vocalist on earth, and it hardly ever got any better than this. This new kind of song where the lyrics didn't matter, the music was all about attitude. Anyway, this is going to be from a Top of the Pops performance back in 1965. Get Off of My Cloud. I've never heard the song, but that Hey You has appeared in several other songs. I wonder if this was the first one that really kind of went after that "Hey You." It was interesting watching the live performance because obviously it's mimed or lip synced, whatever verbiage you prefer to use. But Mick this time didn't have a microphone, so he was able to put on the full. I mean, he's just a little ball of energy. You could really see him trying to mimic James Brown there. And I always enjoy watching Charlie on the drums because it's almost like he's just cool, calm, and collected, just playing those drums, looking around like he's just this observer watching these crazy people perform. So it's always funny to watch, and he does such a good job. But the song itself, great song, kind of like what Evan David said. You know, he just for night owls, man. Mick starts out, lives in an apartment, and is sitting at home looking out his window, imagine the world has stopped, and then flies a guy who's dressed up just like the Union Jack and says, "I've won 5 pounds if I have his kind of detergent pack." He says, "Hey, you get off of my cloud." And at the end, "Don't hang around because two's a crowd on my cloud, baby." Then the telephone's ringing. Voice says, "How are you?" "I'm doing fine." It's 3 a.m. There's too much noise. Don't you people ever want to go to bed because you feel so good? Do you have to drive me out of my head? And then the chorus. And then he drives downtown, wakes up with the parking tickets on his windscreen, stuck on his windscreen, as he puts it. Really, really good song and great performance. Now we'll go back to Spotify for our number 6. You see it below. Out of Time. Evan David says, taken from the UK version, the groundbreaking fully Stones composed Aftermath album, which was released in April of '66. This fascinatingly sardonic tune is perhaps most famous in the guise of the excellent cover version, which Charlie Farlow, another of Andrew Loog Oldham's proteges, would eventually take all the way to number 1 in the UK in July of that year. Certainly both versions have a richly lush instrumental background, with the Stones ones benefiting from being accompanied by both Ian Stewart's Hammond organ and in particularly by budding multi-instrumentalist Brian Jones on a xylophone-esque percussion instrument known as a marimba. As Keith would later put it, Brian had pretty much given up on the guitar by Aftermath. If there was another instrument around, he had to be able to get something out of it. It's just because it was there. At that point, it was a great thing. It gave the Stones on record a lot of different textures and sounds we wouldn't have done otherwise. Little touches that make you think at the time, oh no, he's going to play the bloody marimbas. But afterwards you think, yeah, right, that did it. Oldham later admitted that Brian's various contributions to this album can in fact be heard on every track, and what he didn't know how to play, he went out and learned. Of equal importance to the tune's success, however, was Jagger's surprisingly ambivalent delivery of what on the surface are rather caustic lyrics, ruthlessly mocking an ex-lover and former social butterfly who, quote, thought you were a clever girl giving up your social world, but who has instead fallen hopelessly behind the times on both fronts after choosing to take a self-imposed sabbatical from the ever-frenetic London social scene. And yet there still appears, at least to Evan David's ears at least, to be a certain amount of lingering affection, or at the very least patronizing pity, in Jagger's voice for the poor misguided soul who finds that she's been in fact thoroughly replaced by both the singer and within her social circles to boot. This is the longest song on here because I'm playing the full album version. That's the way to do it at 5:36. Let's check it out. Out of Time. For sure those marimbas give this thing an interesting texture. Not a ton of lyrics here, you know. You don't know what's going on. You've been away for far too long. You can't come back and think you're all still mine. You're out of touch, my baby, poor discarded baby. And then that chorus, which just repeats a ton at the end as well. Well, baby, 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 you're out of time. The way it's delivered, it just sticks in your head. Mick doesn't hurry it. He kind of stretches out that out of time, and it just sticks in your head. Like I said, it doesn't feel repetitive at all. The girl who wants to run away discovers she's had her day. It's no good. You're thinking that you are still mine. You're out of touch. And then he gets into the baby, baby, baby. You thought you were a clever girl giving up your social world. Well, you can't come back and be the first in line. Oh, no. So she's lost her place. You can't just step back in where you were. The instrumentation was great. Like I said, the marimbas add this nice texture to it. As always, Charlie's drumming is just a nice little constant there. And Mick does a fantastic job as usual. And now we're up to the top half of the list. At number 5, it's going to be over on YouTube, a live performance. We have Lady Jane. Evan David says another Aftermath tune, this time including both the US and UK versions of the album. This beautiful ballad marks both a further shift away from the more contemporary instrumentation usually heard on Stones records, even the ballads. while at the same time transporting the Stones' trademark cynicism about relationships to a more traditional historic context, whereby no matter how many flowery pledges of courtly love that Jagger makes to his various ladies in the songs, ultimately this ruthless social climber is always going to plump for the hand of the one featured in the title. While the ex-history teacher in me, naturally, this is Evan David talking about, I'm an ex-history teacher too, adores all the various period touches found in the lyrics, variously described as being inspired by Henry VIII's relationship with his third wife, Jane Seymour, the language of English poet Geoffrey Chaucer, D.H. Lawrence's scandalous novel Lady Chatterley's Lover, and one of Jagger's high society acquaintances, Wayne Ormsby Gore, who was the daughter of a former British ambassador to the U.S. It must be noted this tune also stands as one of the most prominent showcases of Brian's ever-evolving musical talents at this point. For as one of the Stones' aristocratic acquaintances during the 60s, antique dealer Christopher Gibbs pointed out, quote, Brian was a very difficult person to spend a lot of time with. He was a willful, spoiled, demanding, heroically selfish, and self-centered being with a lot of sweetness and charm. And part of that charm was this glorious musical gift of being able to pick up any instrument from any culture in the world and fiddle about with it until he could make it do what it was meant to do, end quote. The sublime gift exemplified when he was able to compose small melodies on George Harrison's sitar within an hour or so of George handing him the massive instrument one night. In the case of Lady Jane, Brian would play a fretted string instrument known as an Appalachian dulcimer, originally of 19th century Celtic diaspora origin, which has recently been revived by American folk musician Richard Farina, with arranger Jack Nitschke providing accompaniment on the harpsichord to boot. And as far as I'm concerned, the results are glorious. We're checking out an Ed Sullivan performance in September of '66 over on YouTube. Lady Jane, what a fun performance to watch because it's so much different than the other stuff we've seen, and how the guys have evolved. I mean, it's not much later, it's 1966, but, Charlie back there just standing up with that mustache, just barely, and then everybody else kind of just sitting down. The dulcimer was exciting to see Brian go after that thing, and then Mick, this very understated performance because the song is very understated. This song itself would have to grow on me a little bit. I know it's a huge hit. It kind of grew on me as it went on, but it's my least favorite song so far, but I enjoyed watching the performance, and it's a love song. My sweet Lady Jane, when I see you again, your servant am I, and I will humbly remain. Just heed this plea, my love, on bended knee, my love, I pledge myself to Lady Jane. Then he goes on to Lady Anne. Then he goes on to Oh My Sweet Marie. There's not a lot of lyrics to this. It's just 3 verses, right? But he's pledging first he pledges myself to Lady Jane. I pledge my troth to Lady Jane. Then life is secure with Lady Jane. So I really enjoyed watching that one. Now we're back to Spotify. You see it below. Number 4 is Backstreet Girl, taken from the UK version of what Evan David would contend to be the Stones' most underrated 60s album, Between the Buttons, released in January of '67. Also later included in the U.S. compilation album Flowers in June of '67. This is undoubtedly the most obscure tune on this list, and as such often slips between the critical cracks when it comes to the band's more famous musical and other achievements during their oft-turbulent first decade. Nevertheless, I for one find myself irresistibly drawn to it, partly due to the sweeping waltz-like elegance of its exquisite instrumentation, including, for example, a vibraphone played by Brian, a harpsichord played once again by Ian Stewart, and finally an accordion played by one Nick DeCaro, and partly due once more to Jagger's lyrical and vocal skill in portraying the romantic and social dilemmas that can occur in a culture as riddled with seemingly unbridgeable yet practically porous class barriers as the one that he himself grew up in. In a sort of roundabout quasi-sequel to the previous tune, the slumming aristocratic-sounding singer is now pleading with his lower-class lover to be content with the discreet, semi-socially acceptable mistress role he wants her to play as his clandestine bit of rough on the side, and above all, not to bother his wife. It's always a good goal. Yet for all his apparently dismissive know-your-place attitude towards her, what might in other Stones tunes come across as a sinister threat here becomes more of a longing, even quasi-affectionate plea not to upset the proverbial apple cart and to instead maintain their existing status quo. There you go, Backstreet Girl. It's only one long verse. There's no chorus. I mean, he does just come back to just you be my Backstreet Girl. I mentioned during the song itself, such unique instrumentation, as Evan David pointed out in the intro, gives it such a unique sound. Really enjoyed it. He is just telling her, he starts out telling her he wants her to kind of feel good about herself. Don't want to tell you, I just want you to be around. But then he says, don't want you out in my world. Please don't be part of my life. Keep yourself to yourself. Don't you bother my wife. That way you won't get no help. Don't try to ride on my horse. You're rather common and coarse anyway. So that's not really nice, is it, Mick? And then he tells her, don't come knocking on my door. Don't call me on the phone. Please take the favors I grant. And at the very end, just you be my Backstreet girl. A very almost hypnotic performance with the instrumentation and just mixed delivery. So I did enjoy that one. Now we're up to number 3. You see it below. She's a Rainbow, released as a U.S. single in December of '67, only reached 25 in the U.S. This truly spectacular tune was taken from that month's Their Satanic Majesty's Request album, aka the Stones' oft-derided experimental attempt to ride that year's psychedelic bandwagon, as epitomized by, of course, the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper masterpiece. I would in fact contend that apart from one or two clunkers, this album isn't half as bad as it's painted, especially coming from a band which had been through the psychic ringer in more ways than one during this time. Mick and Keith's narrow judicial escape following the infamous drugs bust, following hard on the heels of the tempestuous and indeed often mutually violent relationship between Brian, who was himself facing drug charges as well, and Anita Pallenberg, finally breaking down with Anita, ultimately leaving Brian for Keith after all three had gone on a road trip to Morocco together. I mean, you could do just a whole video on that whole triangle. Moreover, the recording process for the album was itself particularly chaotic too, with the result that Andrew Loog Oldham finally quit as the Stones producer, and Bill Wyman describing a uniquely unproductive atmosphere whereby, quote, every day at the studio it was a lottery as to who would turn up and what, if any, positive contribution they would make when they did. Keith would arrive with anywhere up to 10 people, Brian with another half a dozen, and it was the same for Mick. There were sort of girlfriends and friends. I hated it. And Evan David puts, as far as the purely musical results of all this chaos are concerned, however, I'd say that at the very least, this multicolored musical kaleidoscope of a song, which not only features Brian on the mellotron, among other things, but also as a truly glorious string arrangement by future Led Zeppelin stalwart John Paul Jones, it still stands out as an unusually joyful and perhaps even pretty Stones tune, and one which actually celebrates women to boot, or their idealized surface attributes anyway. Still a bit of a departure for a band of whose 60s output has, for good or ill, often been seen as having at least some misogynistic overtones, both then and now. Also, if you're listening to the full-length album version, which we are, watch out for Jagger's brief but memorable spoken word performance as a Cockney market trader / carnival barker at the start of the tune. Let's check it out. She's a Rainbow. It says this has Nicky Hopkins on piano as well, the great Nicky Hopkins. Obviously, a very Pepper-like. Actually, John Lennon was on record as saying he thought this song was directly trying to copy All You Need Is Love. I don't know if I heard that in there so much, but it definitely sounds like it'd be on Sgt. Pepper's, from the very carnival barker type Mick Jagger in the beginning, and really building that atmosphere with a couple different instrumental breaks in there, one to start with and then one before verse 1. Interesting song. I kind of got into it and just vibed with it. I'm actually going to have to listen to this album. I think we've had one song off this album on a live stream at one time. Otherwise, I've just never visited this album, but she comes in colors everywhere. She combs her hair. She's like a rainbow. She comes in colors. And have you seen her dressed in blue? See the sky in front of you, and her face is like a sail, speck of white so fair and pale. Have you seen a lady fair? And then she's in gold, and it just kind of just keeps revisiting that. She's like a rainbow. Supposedly it's about Marianne Faithfull, but who knows? But really did enjoy that different kind of performance. Everyone was just kind of spot on instrumentation wise, and as always, man, Mick really carries this thing. Now we're up to number 2. You See It Below, the famous Jumping Jack Flash. Evan David says released as a single in both the UK and US in the summer of '68, where it reached number 3 and number 1 respectively. This truly rocking tune memorably has perhaps the most compelling opening guitar riff, originally improvised by Bill during a studio jam with Brian and Charlie while waiting for their bandmates to arrive, and later refined by Keith, of any Stones song since Satisfaction, and has indeed been described by Keith Richards as being, quote, really Satisfaction in reverse, except it's played on chords instead of fuzz tone, end quote. Regarded by many as a welcome return to form following the shambolic goings-on of their previous album, the origins of the tune itself are perhaps ironically prosaic, with the title being inspired by the clumping noise which Mick and Keith could hear being made by the heavy footsteps of Keith's own gardener while the pair were staying at Keith's country estate. Equally memorable were the tune's infamously cryptic lyrics with such mysterious, enigmatic phrases such as, I was born in a crossfire hurricane, being brought to electrifying life by Mick's epic vocal performance. A historic early example of this tune's live power during this period can be found in this clip I'd like you guys to react to, as it was taken from the Stones' fabled Rock and Roll Circus concert film, which was originally filmed in December of '68, but which was then sadly put on the proverbial shelf for years, allegedly because the ring-rusty Stones felt they'd been visibly upstaged and outplayed by some of the supporting acts, such as Jethro Tull and The Who. As the Stones' new manager, the notorious and scummy, I put that one in there, Alan Klein would bluntly put it, The Who blew you off your own stage. Evan David says, this is a shame, not only because Rock and Roll Circus would represent the last known performance of Brian Jones with the Stones on film, but because I, for one, would contend that their live performance of Jumpin' Jack Flash at least is still pretty darn compelling. Jumpin' Jack Flash, what a performance. And, it's interesting, just like the Beatles, these guys evolved in look so much, just year to year to year, because everything in the culture was evolving so quickly. They got the longer hair, much more colorful clothes on. Mick was really right on here, controlling this crowd. And the crowd, what a crazy environment, that circus type environment, and people over there dancing and going crazy. I mentioned during the reaction, I've seen a clip from this, not this song, but I remember the crowd like that on one of our live streams. But, basically Jumpin' Jack Flash had some tough stuff in his life, but it's okay, because I'm Jumpin' Jack Flash. It's a gas, gas, gas. He was born in that crossfire hurricane. He was raised by a toothless, bearded hag, schooled with a strap right across his back. He was drowned, washed up, and left for dead. He was crowned, and as Mick put it, showed with a spike right through my head. But it's all right now. I'm Jumpin' Jack Flash. It's a gas. Really enjoyed that, and the performance was super fun. Well, now we're up to number one. You see it below. Gimme Shelter. Evan David says, once again, I'd like to stress this has been a top 10 whose order was roughly based upon the chronology of the Stones' career rather than order of personal preference. But to be honest, there's a very good chance that this frankly apocalyptic tune, taken from the Stones' December '69 album, Let It Bleed, it's the opening track. Like I said, we have a review of it up, would still slouch its way to the very pinnacle of my list regardless. I, for one, have always really dug this tune, perhaps even before I knew it was a Rolling Stones song. He vividly recalls it being used in a TV advertisement. At first glance, the immediate origins of this tune appear to owe much to the vagaries of the British weather. As for Keith Richards describes, I've been sitting by the window of my friend Robert Fraser's apartment in London with an acoustic when suddenly the sky went completely black and an incredible monsoon came down. It was just people running about looking for shelter. That was the germ of the idea. We went further into it until it became, rape and murder are just a shot away. Many other observers have also suggested its sinister atmosphere also owes much to Richards' potentially well-founded suspicion that now that he was with Anita Pallenberg, that she was having an offset affair with Mick while the two of them were filming the surreal hippie gangster movie Performance. This that we're going to show you right here is taken from the BBC's one-off 75-minute TV special, Pop Goes the 60's, which was meant to celebrate the popular music triumphs of the previous decade, and it was broadcast at 10:45 p.m. on the very last day of 1969. And also, Barack Obama, while campaigning for president for his first term, said in an interview with Rolling Stone that the Stones were one of his musical heroes, along with Stevie Wonder, and Gimme Shelter was his favorite Stones song. Let's check this one out. There you have it, Gimme Shelter. Evan David's number one chronologically, and also said it'd be his number one otherwise. I love this song. I loved watching that live performance. It hadn't been that long since we'd seen Mick, but it seems like the boys have aged several years. I think that hard living starts to take its toll. The only thing that I will say this thing is missing, and I really do think it's something that lends so much to it, is Mary Clayton. In that chorus when her and Mick come in on the album version, it's just so powerful. But the lyrics are obviously powerful. In the chorus, war, children, yeah, it's just a shot away, just a shot away. That great guitar. So, I haven't mentioned enough the instrumentation on here because I've been going on about Mick because he's just so talented, and sometimes people don't see that. I know Evan Davis said that at the start, just because he's such a good entertainer, but the voice is so good, and he really can go into different, as we learned through the albums that Trey and I reviewed, this one being one of them. He can take on almost different characters with his vocals, but so good in this one. But of course, throughout, Bill Wyman's been fantastic on the bass, and Charlie, as I mentioned a few times, was great on the drums and had quite the t-shirt on in this one. We got to see once in this live performance, and they made sure and shot him from here on up. And obviously Keith on the guitar is fantastic as well. That song is probably my favorite on this list. Before I get into what my favorites are, we got to go over to the honorable mentions. We have Evan David's honorable mentions are Not Fade Away, Time Is On My Side, Heart of Stone, She Said Yeah, The Singer Not the Song, The Spider and the Fly, Mother's Little Helper, 19th Nervous Breakdown, Paint It Black, a song that I love, Sitting on a Fence, Ruby Tuesday, another fantastic song, Yesterday's Papers, We Love You, No Expectations, Street Fighting Man, You Can't Always Get What You Want, Honky Tonk Woman, Monkey Man, and above all, 2000 Man, Stray Cat Blues, and of course, Sympathy for the Devil. So once again, remember, Evan Dave was trying to give us a little bit of different flair here. My top 10 for the 60s for the Stones would look quite a bit different than this, and yours probably would too, and that shows you, not that Evan David got it wrong, it shows you the depth of their catalog is unbelievable during this time. I always pick my 3 favorite songs off of this. I'm going to go with Play With Fire,